Dear colleagues, hello. It is my honor to greet you at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science of Vilnius University. And today we're going to have a discussion on behalf of the research group that focuses on the Asian, African, and Latin American policies, foreign politics, and domestic policies within this particular institution. And it is my honor and it is my pleasure to introduce Fabio Belafatti, who happens to be the leading specialist on Central Asian politics, who is a colleague working at the Institute of Asian and Transcultural Studies at the Faculty of Philosophy at Vilnius University, but he also happens to be a PhD student at Groningen University in the Netherlands. And today, quite obviously, we're going to talk about Kazakhstan, about Kazakhstani politics. And well, basically, this is something which has been in the headlines, and I believe the whole trend is still continuing. A week plus has already passed since the beginning of the protests, and I believe at this particular time we can already make some tentative conclusions subject to the whole crisis. So I'm going to start with a very particular topic in this regard. When the whole crisis erupted, we had a personal chat with Fabio, quite obviously dealing with the whole thing. And Fabio told me that he actually saw it coming. And quite some of the analysts were actually not that much focused on Central Asia to begin with. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm also dealing with Central Asian politics a bit, but definitely this has not been my primary area of expertise and interest. But gladly, we do have Fabio in this regard. So Fabio, if I may, can we start with this particular question? What were the actual indicators that you actually saw and that actually made you believe that something was brewing up in Kazakhstan and eventually this whole thing erupted? So let me leave this for a minute or so, and since apparently the viewers, the auditorium is still gathering, we're going to have a discussion for some 40 to 45 minutes maximum, and I would definitely be willing to leave some room for the Q&A session, and I would strongly encourage the auditorium to pose their questions in the Facebook group, in the actual event group. You can do that in English or Lithuanian. Fabio knows Lithuanian language very well, but it's simply for the purposes of convenience that we're going to use English language, and in any case, I can help out with the translation if some extra, more complex issues would be raised within the question. So having said that, can we get back to the original question? So how did you see the whole eruption of the crisis in Kazakhstan? What were the actual indicators that told you previously that something akin to what has happened might actually happen? Thank you.
Thank you, Konstantinos. First off, as usual, you're way too kind and too generous when introducing me. I don't want to, claim to have prophesized exactly what would happen. I think we need to be clear on something. Literally no one could predict something on this scale and with these specific forms. Even scholars whom I've talked with who live in Kazakhstan, Kazakhs themselves, and who have been studying their country's politics were not really able to, were taken aback by the sheer scale and size of the protest and by the death toll as well, which was absolutely staggering. So that, I think, should be stated in the first place. That said, however, there are I would say, two camps when it comes to the analysis of Kazakhstan. One camp is the one that I proud myself of belonging to, which is those that have been prophesizing, or at least anticipating, some sort of tension for quite a while. In my case, I started writing about the risk of serious social unrest in Kazakhstan in 2011, so more than a decade ago, when I just started working as a political analyst on Central Asia, and then I wrote a number of occasions on something similar, and especially warning about the risks connected to a political transition. And I was actually reading back some of the stuff I wrote in 2013 and noticing that actually quite a lot of that was to the point. But even those of us who knew that some problems were brewing in Kazakhstan, we did not expect such a scale of protest. So we need to be a bit modest and sincere about that. Then there is the other camp, let's say, of political analysis, which is mainly connected to mainstream media, and that tended to see Kazakhstan as this sort of extremely stable and extremely peaceful country, economically prosperous, where it is worth investing a lot of money. It should be clear that Kazakhstan has, or at least had until very recently, a massive budget for public relations. It's the only Central Asian country that has a systematic public relations strategy. So they pay millions to PR specialists all around the world, especially in the West, to produce coverage about Kazakhstan and knowledge about Kazakhstan that is friendly to the government, that is sympathetic to the country, and that is essentially aimed at doctoring the international media's view of the country and project an image of a positive and stable state entity. And they have obviously been relying a lot on the fact that we tend to look at Central Asia through the prism of regionalism, right? We tend to talk about Central Asia as a region, the region of Central Asia. And therefore, we inevitably tend to make comparisons constantly with other countries in the region. Each of the Central Asian countries is different, is profoundly different, and has very unique characteristics. We talk about them as Central Asia, and we talk about them as one region in our courses, like I do, merely because of academic reasons, because you have to classify countries in some way or another to make it meaningful from an academic point of view. However, it must be clear that these countries have major differences. The big mistake that the international media, in my opinion, has made over the years, over the decades probably, has been to always look at Kazakhstan through the prism of the entire region, right? And in the rest of the region, you have a country like Tajikistan, which faced a civil war and more or less regular episodes of political violence on a fairly large scale until fairly recently, which is by many seen as almost a failed state. I disagree with that, but anyway, that's a talk for another day. And you have a country like Kyrgyzstan, which has faced, well, basically 3 revolutionary events since independence. We can call them revolutions, we can call them coups, it's, again, another discussion. But 3 revolutionary events and countless protests, street protests at a local, regional, and national level. So obviously, in contrast, Kazakhstan always appeared to be like the good student in the class, seen from this very patronizing Western perspective. And not a lot of people actually bothered to look into the problems that the country faced. It also did not help the fact that, as I mentioned, Kazakhstan was itself investing a lot in producing knowledge about itself, which is something quite uncommon for countries in the post-Soviet world. They generally get narrated by somebody else. And Kazakhstan was one of the few countries that had the economic power to narrate itself. But it narrated itself in a way that was coherent with the interests of the ruling elite, not of the country, and certainly not of the population. So the image that that Kazakhstan projected was I like to make I always like to make parallels with the case of Iran until the Islamic Revolution. You have an authoritarian leader, Nazarbayev and Tokayev in Kazakhstan versus the Pahlavi Shah in Iran, which had an active campaign of projecting an image of the country as incredibly modern and incredibly stable. And in reality, lots of tension simmering and lots of repression of the media and of human rights activists. And then everybody acts surprised because, oh, wow, what's going on? How is it possible that a country that looked so stable on the surface is actually so problematic? So Kazakhstan, in a way, fell prey of what I call the Iranian syndrome, in that it was victim of the excessively positive image of itself that it created. So just as many were surprised by the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, likewise, many were surprised by the Kazakh unrest of 2022. Although it should be mentioned that there has been unrest in Kazakhstan in 2011, in 2013, 2016, between 2018 and 2020, and then in 2022. What is also interesting is that it correlates with economic performance, but not always, right? So we've had actually tensions and unrest in periods when the economy was not doing particularly bad. And on the surface, the Kazakh economy is doing well. It has had consistent growth, I believe, since 1998, with peaking in the early 2000s at like plus 10% GDP growth per year. Even in the times of the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, it was still able to maintain positive economic growth. So the problem here is that, number one, the country also has a demographic growth, which is quite impressive. And that means that you have to have a rate of economic growth that is at least enough to produce jobs for the young people that come into the job market every year. Some countries, and Kazakhstan has been the most successful country in Central Asia in doing so, but clearly not successful enough. Then obviously there is the problem of the gas prices and oil prices, which have caused stark fluctuations in the growth rate of Kazakhstan's economy. But at the end of the day, I think Kazakhstan has, well, the Kazakh elite has become victim of its own narrative, in that even though Kazakhstan is by far the richest country in the region, they have built expectations that are even higher than what they were able to deliver. There is a bit of a paradox in Kazakhstan's economy, in that, and political system, in that on the one hand, the political elite has always realized the need to generate prosperity and distribute prosperity among the population, much more than in other countries in the area. There are different reasons for that, which basically date back to the way the country became independent in 1991, but I'm not going to get into that unless you want me to. But there always was a necessity for the country's elite to deliver public services, public goods, and economic prosperity to the population in a broader sense than it's done in other authoritarian regimes. At the same time, however, this is and was and has always been an authoritarian regime, has always been dictatorship in a way. And authoritarian regimes, obviously, because of their nature, because of the way they function internally, and because of the way the political economy is structured, tend to have to always prioritize the economic prosperity of the ruling elite. So there has always been this constant tension between it, right? On the one hand, Nazarbayev and his allies desire to become rich, to put it very mildly, to put it very bluntly. And they have definitely succeeded with that. They have accumulated spectacular wealth. They have become fantastically rich. And they have been very successful in hiding that wealth until a number of investigative journalism reports came out that revealed secret villas and massive real estate investments in London and this kind of stuff. And on the other hand, you have this tension to, okay, well, try and deliver something to the population and build legitimacy for the regime by constantly reminding people of how great things are, which again, yes, compared with Tajikistan, it's great. Compared with Kyrgyzstan, it's great. But the problem is, if you create the impression that your country can do everything and that it's ruled by such a wise and civic-minded leader that really cares about the population, well, the Kazakhs are not stupid. They knew that something was going on. They knew that there were actually problems. They knew that a lot of the wealth that was being generated was ending up in the pockets of the ruling elite. So it doesn't actually matter that there may be poorer countries in the area. It mattered that there was a disconnection between the expectations that the elite was building as a way to create regime legitimacy, and the reality for people. And the reality for people was that, sure, I mean, life had gotten better since the times of the economic crisis of the early 1990s. Certainly things had improved. However, they had also improved in a way that created massive economic inequalities. Massive economic inequalities not only at a regional level. There are often talks about the regional inequalities between the Western regions in the capital, basically Nur Sultan, and the major city, which is Almaty, but also within the cities themselves, right? So for a number of years, you've had these two cities on which the elite has invested heavily, especially in Nur Sultan, which was called Astana until recently. Nur Sultan has been basically built from nothing. So the regime literally built the city and literally invested in creating the city. And it has essentially used it as a place of residence for people that work in the state sector, that are relatively friendly to the regime, that are loyal enough to get the benefit to live in this super shiny, fancy new city. Not surprisingly, there were far fewer riots in Nur Sultan than there were elsewhere. And then they also invested a lot in developing the urban area of Almaty, creating economic prosperity there. But they did so by building a urban-based middle class or upper middle class that was fairly small in size, and an incredibly rich upper middle class or political aristocracy, let's say, that was basically the people close to the ruling elite, which was even small, very, very small fraction of the country's population. A lot of the tensions that, this created a lot of tensions in that people that came from the countryside or from the regions that were left out of this development program started accumulating grievances and frustration and disappointment over the way the resources were being distributed. Again, they may have not faced the same level of poverty as in other countries in the region, but they could clearly see the stark difference between somebody that was clearly winning in this transition to state capitalism, we could call it like that, and those who were losing. For a number of years, this divide was very geographically concentrated, right? The countrysides and the provincial towns were lagging behind, and the major centers in the north and center and south were sprinting ahead. Over the last few years, however, lots of people have started moving to these two cities of Nur Sultan and Almaty, and have directly faced the direct impact of the economic inequalities. In fact, Kazakhstan has imported a lot of surveillance technology from China over the last years. And it's sometimes described as the regime putting cameras everywhere to control the population, but in reality, in many, many cases, the installation of these surveillance systems was requested by upper middle class people in rich neighborhoods in Nur Sultan and in Almaty to control the rural immigrants, basically, to control other Kazakhs whom they feared could engage in petty crime and so on. So there was clearly a perception of rising social tensions among the population itself, among the different social classes that had been developing since independence. So these degree of economic inequality has always been underestimated in the media narrative and in the analysis. And it's now come to shore. And it's not a coincidence that everything started in Zhanaozen. Zhanaozen is the city in the western part of the country, which is where most of the oil of the country is extracted. But just as many other cities in the area, they do not really benefit that much from the oil wealth. And there has always been this perception among the people in Zhanaozen that, well, we're the ones that essentially produce the country's wealth, and that money is going somewhere else. And a lot of it is actually going on, ending up in the pockets of some powerful leaders. It's also not a coincidence that other cities that were affected by the riots were Aktobe and Aktau, which are, again, in the western areas. These have been hotspots of tension and political violence for a number of years. There have been protests on a more or less regular basis in all of the peripheral cities of Kazakhstan for the last years. So the signs were there for those that wanted to see, but of course the international media narrative rarely focuses on Central Asia, only when something happens. So it tends to rely on the repetition of certain stereotypes and the repetition of certain frameworks of understanding that rely heavily on this idea of regionalism, whereby you've got a region of Central Asia, Kazakhstan is the one that is doing the best, so it's definitely going to be the least dangerous, and if anything, we're going to look at Tajikistan and wonder if it's going to become the second Afghanistan, and that has certainly obfuscated our ability to analyze the country and, well, the region in its entirety, I would say. So yeah. In a nutshell, this is as far as the societal dynamics, right, that may be behind these riots. Then there are the political dynamics, the power struggle between the elites in the context of the transition after Nazarbayev's resignation. That is something that we're still not entirely clear on what exactly happened, but it is clear that there was some kind of struggle between the elites, between two factions, so the pro-Nazarbayev faction and the Tokayev faction, about what to do about the riots, probably, and maybe with one faction of the elite trying to take advantage of the protests and hijacking the protests for their own benefit. We've seen that something very similar happened also in Kyrgyzstan last year, so it's not entirely impossible that it may have happened in Kazakhstan. So that's it as far as the main points of background here.
So did I get it correctly that you basically assume that there was indeed a lot of amount of socioeconomic tension for something of these proportions to actually blow out? Because quite obviously, I do like this idea of yours that whenever there is a clear-cut lack of understanding and comprehension of a certain region, of a certain country, this provides a huge room for various different conspiracy theories, and we have seen a fair share of those both within Kazakhstan, within the public sphere, and this whole thing got even augmented further by the informational blockades, right, on the third and fourth days of the actual protest, when the violence, the most hardcore episodes of that violence erupted. But also turned to be a part and parcel of the Lithuanian debate, and I believe of the Western debate to quite a large degree. And definitely there is a certain amount of disagreements which has a lot to do with lack of our knowledge about the actual power struggle and the positions. You know, where is Mr. Nazarbayev is probably one of those questions that we are probably have no possibility to answer in a clear-cut form at this particular time. But let me address an extra question in this regard. I would definitely agree, and this was definitely my view of the whole thing, that certain hotspots might have erupted. But the big question in this regard, I believe, is the actual spread of the whole thing throughout, well, pretty much the whole country, right? The largest cities. So would you see this as somewhat coordinated, or maybe by some power, or maybe by the protesters themselves? And what can you say about the background of actual protesters, say in Almaty, which proved to be, well, probably the single most important case, and as far as the major cities outside of Western Kazakhstan are concerned? There are apparently quite some of the evidence that basically says that at certain key points in the initial days of the protests, the security was effectively lacking. You know, the police forces, the Almaty International Airport. How can we read this kind of situation? So basically, who were those protesters? How were they mobilized in other parts of Kazakhstan outside of the western part of the country?
Right, so there are quite a few questions here. I would say what I was always expecting was a major, like a large-scale unrest. I did not expect it now, but I have always expected a large-scale level of unrest. I never really expected a revolution. I don't think, even for purely practical reasons, it's really difficult to stage a revolution in a country that is so massive and so sparsely populated, and where the government can simply bunker down in the capital and you know, cut off the capital and then take back the cities one by one. So it's really, really hard to have a revolution in Kazakhstan, but I certainly expected that there would be a very large scale unrest. I did not expect it January 2022. As to the profile of the protesters, we simply do not know yet. I think this is actually the feeling I'm getting from all the people that have been observing Kazakhstan from the ground. We don't yet know. What we know for sure is that the claims of the government that this was a coordinated terrorist event is nonsense. I mean, that's, I think, pretty clear for everyone. The government, President Tokayev claimed that there were something like 20,000 terrorists, mostly from abroad. I mean, that's just ridiculous. There is no way that you can have 20,000 fighters, of which a considerable amount foreign, sneaking into Kazakhstan in secret and nobody noticed. And that's just absurd. And the terrorism claim is
tellingly, he deleted that tweet later on.
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. It was awesome. You know, it means Central Asian authoritarian leaders are famous for being fairly outlandish statements to explain problems in their countries in a way that doesn't require them to take any responsibility. But this one was just so absurd that, I mean, nobody really believed it. We also know that it was not a coup, I think. I may be proven wrong, but I mean, there were 9,900, there have been 9,900 people arrested. So almost 10,000 people arrested up to this point, up to, I think this was yesterday's figure. You do not have 10,000 people arrested when you have a coup. A coup tends to be a much smaller affair. It tends to be much more controlled in terms of the number of people that are involved, because you need to maintain secrecy while you're planning it. It's clear, you know, when you have something like 10,000 people being arrested, it's obvious that there is a mass movement taking place. Because for every person you arrest, there are 10 that manage to escape, or even more. So what we see is that there was a mass movement, certainly, and for sure, the dynamic of the protests was a mass dynamic. We've seen, you know, whole buildings being torched. We've seen looting on a large scale. Whole cities basically being demolished. So that means that there was a mass protest going on. That does not exclude, of course, that there has been intervention by somebody inside the security forces to take advantage of the situation. It would not be the first time that an authoritarian regime splits in different factions. I had expected more tensions at the time of the transition when Nazarbayev resigned from the post of president. But we are seeing these tension emerge now, a few years later. My feeling is that this was very spontaneous. It was very sincere in terms of the rage of the people involved. There were literally thousands upon thousands of people that were absolutely furious over these gas price increase, and that vented on their frustration, which had been accumulating for years, as I mentioned before. So it's not surprising that that something like this happened. And then probably there was an effort to take advantage of this situation, potentially some factions within the Kazakh elite trying to play a Kyrgyzstan 2020 scenario, trying to use a moment of popular dissatisfaction to essentially get rid of Tokayev. And that did not work. And now we are seeing that members of the security services are being arrested, Karim Masimov being the most prominent case. But there were also one of his closest collaborators was found dead. The head of the regional police was found dead. Often in Kazakhstan later turns out to mean that they were assassinated by the regime. So it's difficult to know what the profile of the protesters is, but it's clear from the geography that it includes a mix of of people from these regions that have been experiencing long-term frustration over the performance of the country, as well as people from that lived in Almaty that were probably from these lower income neighborhoods, newcomers that had essentially been pushed to the big city because of poverty in the countryside or because of lack of economic opportunities in the countryside, and witnessed the scale of the economic inequality in the city. And essentially this feeling of rejection and being pushed out and being excluded by the performance of their own country. I think we could talk a lot about how this relates to the experience of other countries in the former Soviet Union, because it's certainly quite relevant. We will know later about the actual involvement of security services. At the moment, it's way too early to say. I would say it's even way too early to know whether Masimov and his faction are actually involved. It might just be that Tokayev simply took the opportunity to get rid of them. But it is clear that there is some kind of power struggle within the elites. Tokayev, when he came to power, he was appointed by Nazarbayev. Essentially, he was handpicked by Nazarbayev. He's a very close, he used to be a very close ally of Nazarbayev. But he immediately took a fairly critical stance of Nazarbayev's policies and tried to advance a policy of reform. So he had these mix of reforms in mind that included more government transparency, which obviously Nazarbayev and his allies did not like, because that probably meant turning over some stones and exposing some corruption scandals that they might have been involved into. He also had in mind a few reforms that might have been unpopular, but he never really managed to go through with those. He was very much stopped in his reform projects by the fact that Nazarbayev's faction wanted first and foremost to maintain the existing power structure, the existing political economy dynamics, to maintain their own wealth, basically, the wealth that they had accumulated and their position within the Kazakh economic system. Now it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because if Tokayev manages to get rid of the Nazarbayev faction, and if he has consolidated his own faction enough over the last years, then we could potentially see some major reforms, which are badly needed, to be honest, for Kazakhstan, because the Kazakh economy, although it has economic growth, it has these level of inefficiency that comes from the fact that part of the resources are constantly diverted for private profit of whoever happens to be close to the presidential inner circle. So there is certainly need for reforms. All countries in Central Asia need that. In Uzbekistan, they realized it first, and the president there, after the transition, put forward a fairly comprehensive program of reforms. Kazakhstan may be next, and we might see some political and economic opening, perhaps.
Great, thank you, Fabio. Let us stay a little bit with Mr. Tokayev, because he's the single most important figure in this whole story. What is your view on the crucial hours and days of the crisis? Did you see Mr. Tokayev, the Kazakhstani president, as a strong figure? And how can you interpret his decision to actually ask for help from Russia and the Collective Security Treaty Organization in this regard? And it also leads me somewhat to an extra question about the international dimension of the conflict. So did I get it correctly that you are basically saying that the initiation of the protest had nothing to do with international dimensions, be that the alleged Western threat or the Islamist movements, particularly the radical Islamists, or maybe, which is probably a little bit more viable in this regard, the Kazakhstani diaspora community, particularly the fallen members of the former elites? Please.
Look, the Kazakhstani immigrant community and the fallen members of the elite have been blamed for everything that has happened in Kazakhstan since the Zhanavzen massacre in 2011. They always blame Mukhtar Ablyazov and others for being the ones that are behind everything, bankrolling, allegedly bankrolling all sorts of protests and so on. That's not how protests work. In an authoritarian system, I cannot think of any authoritarian regime where émigré elites have played any major role in triggering mass protests. Mass protests have foundation in social dynamics that are taking place in the country. You can have foreign elites or external backers that sponsor coups. Yeah, sure. I mean, but those are generally very, very small affairs. The history of the Cold War is full of examples of military coups taking place with funding from whoever outside of whatever country. But those are generally small. They tend to take place in military junta type of authoritarian regimes. Kazakhstan is not a military dictatorship. It is essentially an electoral dictatorship, and like all electoral dictatorships, it relies on dynamics of legitimacy, which are partly discursive and partly material, and it relies heavily on patronage networks. So the ability of whoever is in power to build a patronage network that makes sure that some people will be willing to fight and defend the regime, because otherwise they lose access to the economic benefits. And this brings me to your second question about, actually that was the first, about Tokayev. Obviously, at this stage, we can only see Tokayev as a strong leader, but it remains to be seen whether he is able to actually weather the storm. What is for sure is that he now has to be seen as much stronger than many people had previously assumed, including me, to be honest. I always saw Tokayev as a bit of a very weak figure that was just a placeholder as Nazarbayev had resigned. And I'm pretty sure that Nazarbayev also expected him to be like that, to just continue the policies, not really change much. Nazarbayev picked Tokayev from his innermost circle because he probably expected him to just continue the same policies exactly as before. Tokayev actually changed things, and he was he seems to have been successful in building his own power base, which probably means that he was able to build his own patronage networks within the regime, enough to maintain the loyalty of most of the repressive apparatus, though not all of it. And the fact that he called on the CSTO to intervene means that he was probably afraid of losing a big chunk of the security services, which is new for Central Asia. Usually governments succeed in establishing total control over the security services. So he clearly had not enough strength to maintain full control over the repressive apparatus of the country, but he was certainly much stronger than his enemies expected. And the intervention of the CSTO in Russia clearly shows that, well, as usual, Russia doesn't really care who is in power as long as certain policies are maintained that are friendly to the Russian Federation. And even though Putin and Nazarbayev may have had a long history of collaboration and even friendship, perhaps, at the end of the day, what mattered for Russia was keeping Kazakhstan stable. They had been dealing with Tokayev since he came to power for a few years now, so they had clearly invested in building trust with him, and they were not interested in having a change in leadership. They just favored and preferred stability and continuation of power rather than any sort of transformation. And in this context, even a long-term ally or friend like Nazarbayev can be just ditched along the way in favor of broader state objectives. So I would read the intervention of the peacekeeping forces in these terms, basically, as a sign of not enough strength of a president that is, however, much stronger than most people had previously anticipated.
Very well. An extra question in this regard, and I believe this is something of quite a lot of interest to us here in Lithuania, because we tend to compare the situation with Belarus and the Ukrainian dynamics, because we tend to know more about that than, say, the events in neighboring Kyrgyzstan or the rest of Central Asia. What might be the impact of this actual decision to actually call for the Russian, for CSTO help for Tokayev's legitimacy in his power position within the elite structure, particularly vis-a-vis the security forces, and within the population at large, particularly its ethnically Kazakh majority?
Mm-hmm. You're asking me here really the million-dollar question. It's difficult to say. For the population, obviously, this is going to have a negative impact in terms of regime legitimacy, because clearly, when you call for troops from another country, it doesn't speak highly of your regime's internal ability to maintain internal legitimacy, that's for sure. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much for the country and for the population, because anyway, they've been living under an authoritarian regime that lacks widespread legitimacy for 30 years. So this is some extra harm that comes to the image of the regime, but as long as the repressive capability of the regime is restored, then they can still maintain control over the country, even if they suffer a hit in terms of legitimacy. And they can always rebuild some trust through these reforms that Tokayev has been claiming to be interested in, and has always said that was hindered by the Nazarbayev faction. I don't really trust Tokayev when he criticizes Nazarbayev for creating a class of super rich people, because he's certainly one of those super rich people, and he certainly benefited from Nazarbayev's system. But, this might be a wake-up call for the Kazakh regime, and they might take this opportunity to actually start changing a few things and stop believing their own propaganda and realizing that actually, yeah, we do have some problems. We've been denying it, or we've been actually killing journalists over this, but we do have problems. So we have to do something if we are to survive as a regime. In Uzbekistan, they have done it. They've been quite successful in that. They have pushed for reforms in the context of reduced authoritarianism, relatively. So it is possible that they will do it in Kazakhstan as well. Keeping in mind, of course, that the moment a regime shows some weakness, that can be potentially devastating for a country. So, I mean, how to assess what Tokayev did? He's an authoritarian leader, so he did exactly what you would expect the leader of a rigidly authoritarian regime to do. Kazakhstan is not only an authoritarian country, it is also a relatively prosperous country, so there is a lot of money to be lost over, losing a position of power in Kazakhstan. So, not surprisingly, he tried to defend his position. Obviously, this does not mean that I am, giving any kind of moral approval of what he did. That's completely outside of the question. But it is what we would have expected of him, and what the international reaction has been. Again, is something that is expected. The moment the request was made for aid, Russia's preference for authoritarian stability kicked in and stepped in to defend the person that was their point of reference in Kazakhstan for the last 3 years, basically.
Darwal, since we're bit by bit approaching the end of our discussion today, I would like to repeat my call for the auditorium to pose their questions. We have some 10 minutes or so to go. And I do have a final question for you, Fabio, on my behalf, which is actually in the title of our today's discussion. So Coup, Maidan, how those comparisons are, do they stick? Are they logical, or are we merely attempting to comprehend the Kazakhstani complexity by using the frameworks that we know better?
Coup or Maidan? Neither. Certainly not a coup. Potentially an attempt to take advantage of instability to stage some sort of coup, but certainly not a coup. Certainly not a Maidan either, because there wasn't the kind of, doesn't seem to have been the kind of long-term vision among the protesters. I mean, Maidan started for a very clear reason that had to do with a very clear idea of what Ukraine wanted to be in the following years. These protests started because of an immediate decision and instantly erupted into tension over something that had been accumulating for decades, but was not yet articulated into any kind of clear political platform of political project. There is obviously the key difference that Ukraine, even before the Euromaidan, was still more democratic than Kazakhstan. So there was in Ukraine the space to at least elaborate and discuss and come up with different dreams about what the country should look like. Discussions in the media and so on. Not so much in Kazakhstan, where on the other hand, the control over the media is much, much tighter. There essentially is no real opposition parties, except for like a couple of exiled leaders. So it's a very, very different context, and it's impossible really to articulate a major political project in such a context like that of Kazakhstan under Nazarbayev and under Tokayev. Some scholars have classified Kazakhstan as a sultanism, so the kind of regime where you have a figure that has essentially personal control over the state, and especially over the state's economy, and administers the state's economy as his personal fief, like a sultan, like a king. I disagree with that classification, but I do believe that Kazakhstan had one aspect and has one aspect that sultanistic regimes tend to have, which is the the suppression of political discussion, the suppression of political debate. Sultanistic regimes tend to have extremely dormant spaces for political discussion. In that sense, Kazakhstan was certainly like that. So not surprisingly, this kind of protests take this very sudden and very extemporaneous form, but they lack the kind of project that there was, for example, in something like Maidan in Ukraine. So yeah, my answer would be neither Maidan nor a coup, something else. We will see in the next few days, probably, by looking at who gets arrested within the elite and who gets freed among the 10,000 people that have been arrested so far. That will give us an indication of, whom the regime actually considers to be the threat. Will probably give us a good indication of, who was behind this attempt to hijack the popular protests. We will never really fully know the truth. Spoilers alert, but we can rest. We will never know exactly what happened. This is just something that is not possible to find out in these kind of authoritarian regimes. But we will, at least by looking at who gets arrested and who gets freed, we will at least be able to get a clearer idea of the different factions involved and who was, actually behind at least part of the unrest.
I managed to take a look at the Q&A session. Apparently there are no questions posed to this particular point. Let me finalize with one extra question, and I mean this is another major one. Considering the sheer fact that there's quite a lot of Western interest there, considering the sheer fact that we tend to read the situation as yet another example of the rising authoritarianism across much of the world, including the Eurasian mega space and the sheer center, right, of the Eurasian mega continent. What should our reaction be in terms of the Western world, in terms of maybe Lithuanian foreign policy makers as well, considering that yet again that this government pursues the so-called values-based foreign policy? Is there any kind of leverage that we have there, or or shouldn't we bother at all with what's going on in that country?
Mm-hmm. You've been a colleague and also a friend for a number of years. You know that my view tends to be that of not preaching too much when our countries are directly engaged in enabling authoritarianism. So we'll maybe repeat myself from previous events, perhaps. I mean, Lithuania doesn't really have much to do in these, and I don't really think that this value-based foreign policy can really play that much of a role, because the relations are cordial, but not particularly deep, so there is no leverage that Lithuania has. But if we look at the West in a broader sense, the European Union and European Union countries, I think at the very least what we need to do is to stop helping authoritarian regimes remain in power, because we always have this tension between the European Union making these very, very idealistic statements about democracy, human rights, calling itself very concerned about all sorts of tensions everywhere. But the reality is that individual member states are engaging in practices of money laundering that directly benefit the authoritarian leaders. They engage in investments, knowing perfectly well that the money they're investing ends up in the pockets of the ruling elites of these countries. So, there is no point really in having the European Union or the OSCE or NATO calling for democracy and human rights when in Central Asia, when you have, I don't know, the Italian companies pouring money into the Tajik regime, French companies sending money to the Turkmen regime, Swedish companies allegedly helping out with bribes the Uzbek regime, and then British banks or British companies supporting essentially the kleptocracy in Kazakhstan. So first we need to stop that. And we need to be very honest about the fact that we make a lot of money by laundering the money that authoritarian leaders steal from their own population in their own countries. So first we stop that, and then perhaps we can. I'm not saying that we should stop talking about human rights. We can continue doing that, but it's going to be completely useless unless we actually cease to be enablers of authoritarianism. So there is a lot of soul searching that needs to be done, in my opinion, about the way we interact with authoritarian regimes. We tend to do that here in Lithuania. We tend to do it a lot when we analyze the hypocrisy that Western countries have vis-a-vis Russia. So we're pretty good at doing that because we can see the contradiction between, say, a country like Germany making certain statements about Russia and democracy there, but then also engaging in very, very profitable economic cooperation with Russia. We are, I think, here in Lithuania, we are well placed to expand a little bit the framework and the observation point, and see that, well, actually, there's a whole bunch of other authoritarian regimes with which we behave. We, not as Lithuanians or Lithuanian residents, but we as Western countries, we behave hypocritically, right? By, on the one hand, talking about principles, but not really living up to those principles in the way we conduct business with those countries and with those regimes. So we have to close that gap, and we have to make sure that we, at the very least, we're not enabling these kind of things, not least for a purely practical, purely moral reason, to sleep well with our own conscience.
Fabio, may I ask a couple of extra minutes of yours, because we do have a very pertinent question. It's the one that I failed to ask, though it's definitely on the mind of I believe, the vast majority of us here. I'm going to read the question aloud. Bearing in mind the highest invitation of CSTO's troops, what are the implications of this process for Russia's role in Kazakhstan? So it has to do a fair share of officials related to Russia, not only Kazakhstan, but, and in addition to that, the question proceeds as follows. Can we expect an increased influence of the Kremlin in the country? Thank you. Thank you for the question posed as well.
Well, Russia has built a fairly successful and fairly convenient relationship with Kazakhstan in that the Eurasian Economic Union, of which Kazakhstan is a member, is an economic arrangement that is fully advantageous to Russia. So it obviously seeks to maintain it like that. And in my opinion, what would be rational to desire would be to continue doing things exactly like that. So maintain these very convenient economic arrangement that allows Russia to have a net export balance sheet with Kazakhstan, essentially Kazakhstan being more or less obliged to buy stuff from Russia, even though it may not be convenient, without having to get involved directly on a long-term basis. And we've seen actually that there already is a timeline for withdrawal of the CSTO troops. I think Russia has already its hands full in other parts of the former Soviet space, unfortunately for us and for our Ukrainian friends. So it clearly does not want to get bogged down in Kazakhstan. And as long as stability or regime stability is restored, that's fine. As long as they can resume to go back to this kind of economic arrangement in which, well, Russia has everything to win, then I don't really see any reason for Russia to set up any kind of long-term presence. But, you know, Russia has surprised us in the past, and they cannot exclude that it will again in the future. So
apparently no annexation of northern Kazakhstan after all, and that's a positive note, right?
I don't think so. Yeah, exactly. I don't think that it will happen. And yes, it is, of course, a positive note. We've had way too many annexations explicit or otherwise in the last decade by Russia. So I think it's
so with this positive note, and characteristically though for this whole discussion, I would like to thank you, Fabio, first of all, for being with us today. It was indeed a very enlightening discussion with you, and I would like to thank the auditorium for watching us as well, and I strongly encourage you to follow the developments and the post-Soviet space in general and Central Asia in particular, and Kazakhstan would hopefully remain in the headlines and hopefully in a more positive light as well. Thank you very much, Fabio. I wish to you all of the best.
Thanks,
see you
likewise.
in